Up next, we have Jeremy Gimbel. Jeremy spent about 100 years working for a nonprofit and now is living the easy life at Vector. He has been to every single one of these EE conferences, and he's one of the first people I met, and he's one of the kindest people I know, and he's definitely worth following on Twitter and Instagram at Dreadfully Posh. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeremy Gimbel.
All right, who's excited to talk about Docker? So here's my obligatory who am I slide. I'm Jeremy, obviously. I borrowed this slide from others. Not a husband, not a father. But I am based in Philadelphia. I live and work there from home. I'm a bit of an EE veteran, though I do consider myself an equal opportunity CMS person, but we won't go into too much detail there. But I've been using Expression Engine since 2010, fell in love with it then, still very much like it now. I was the Mojo add-ons guy. So I ran the marketplace that sold add-ons for the very short-lived Mojo motor. I made tens of dollars on that site. And I am now currently the web services manager at Vector Media Group. So I'm glad to be representing them here today. So before I begin talking about Docker, I want to talk a little bit about the progression that kind of led me to Docker, and I feel a lot of people kind of take the same path. So we all start the same way, editing live on the server, probably with FTP. I call it the do it live approach. And it's pretty typical for someone who's just getting into web development, which I've found is fairly common in this community. A lot of people have come from other careers or different things, and they kind of jump into it head first and start building websites with it. So the do it live approach is scary, and it's dangerous. It's generally awful. If this is your approach, don't do it anymore, please stop. So eventually we get frustrated with that approach, or we have a colossal disaster that forces us to change our ways. And so we look for ways to start developing locally. So I stumbled upon MAMP. There's other ways to do it. Some people just install the server software locally. There's other tools if you're using other operating systems. It works pretty well, but and it also kind of leads you to better development practices, version control, deployment processes, all that. But then you find that you need a random PHP module, such as IonCube. Oh, or you might have a client that's running Nginx or a different PHP version. And we get lots of, it works for me, why doesn't it work for you? Or you upgrade OS X and you lose it all. So you can only have your local development environment implode on you so many times before you start thinking there's got to be a better way to do this. And so a lot of people then move to something like Vagrant. And you might build your own Vagrant box. You might use something like Homestead or Scotchbox. I did this. It really takes you a long way into improving your process. And it's all virtual, it's portable, it's repeatable. But your development environment still doesn't match your production servers, and your hard drive is now 97.3% full. And if you want to swap out just one thing on that virtual server, it's a whole big ride to make that change. So what do you do now? That is how I got to Docker, the promised land. So Before we get into the specifics, let's talk a little bit about what Docker is. Docker is a virtual computing platform. Makes sense. The big idea here is containerization. So it creates a virtual host machine on your physical computer. Guest machine, it should be, actually. But it creates a virtual machine, a Docker machine. And then you have application-specific containers that run on that they run your web server stack inside that virtual machine. And so these containers are actually lighter weight than a full virtual machine as compared to something like Vagrant. And because they don't actually have the full OS, they have just a part of it that it needs to run. So all this sounds good, but if you've taken a look at Docker before, you start to see all these terms. And there are a lot of them. And if you're like me, you get bogged down with all of these, and what do they mean? How do they relate together? But it's okay. We're going to get through this. We have to, or else we may never make it to the after party. We will probably all need a drink after this, but hopefully we will all have a better way to develop locally as well. So let's talk a little bit about how Docker works before we go into my specific approach here. So the key thing here is that Docker works in layers. Wow, you really can't see those boxes. So Docker files make up the base layer. And a Docker file is just a set of instructions that will build an image, which is the second layer. And the image gets built from a Docker file and is basically a package that contains everything you need to run a container, which is the next layer. And so a container is a running instance of an image. So that's kind of the progression. But it's not quite that simple. So Docker files can actually be built on top of other Docker files, which is very common. So for example, the official Docker file for Apache is based on a Debian Docker file, which is based on another base Debian Docker file, which is based on Scratch, which is Docker's kind of base image that they provide that you build images on top of. And so these layers can be endless. So the next kind of core concept is Docker Compose. Now, Docker Compose is a tool that lets you define multi-container applications. So, we talked about containers before being a running instance of an image, and now we're going to combine multiple containers to create an application. So the applications that we create with those containers get defined in a Docker Compose YAML file. And that configures all the settings that you need to run these containers and your application. The important little side note here is that the containers that are inside your application are called services. I think that's just to add another term into the vernacular here, but just so you know. So here's a sample application. You can see it has 3 different containers, one for Apache, one for PHP, one for Redis. An application could have more containers, it could have tons of containers, it could have less containers depending on what you use, what kind of images you're using to build this. We'll look at this in a little bit more detail later, but this is the general idea. So if you're serious about learning Docker, I'd suggest looking through some more tutorials. What we're going to talk about next is a very specific approach that I've used for local development. It's not going to work for everybody. It's not going to work for every situation. And it really helps to kind of expand your Docker knowledge, especially as you get started with that, and continue learning, because there's a lot of depth to this. It's a very complex product to work with. So I definitely recommend the Servers for Hackers. They have 2 different series on development with Docker, which you can check out. I will put up links again at the end of the presentation, so don't feel the need to take them down right now. So now for the fun part. We're going to talk about Dash, which is my approach. One of the approaches that we actually use at Vector for local Docker-based development environments. We have a little bit of fine print before we jump in here. This is just one approach to doing local development. I've found that it's an easy jumping off point for people who have used MAMP or used a Vagrant box before. Certainly not the only way to do this. There are probably better ways to do this, especially if you're looking into using Docker in production as well. So please don't come at me, bro. Also, side note, I have not tested this outside of a Mac. The general Docker stuff is going to work. Some of the magic of Dash probably will not work. But this will be an open repository on GitHub, so you are welcome to contribute and help make that more accessible to other operating systems as well. So, what is Dash? Dash is both an approach to using Docker and it's an accompanying shell script. This was originally written by the fine folks at IFTTT, which I guess they used it for local development as well. They have since kind of abandoned it, but I have done quite a bit of work on it, extending it, and so my fork of it has a lot of useful tools that really make it useful for the kind of environments that we work with. So what does Dash do? Dash creates what is called a dash, which is a persistent stack of services. As you may recall, the services are just a bunch of containers inside a Docker Compose application. Creates a persistent stack of services that you use across all of your projects. Then you have project-specific services that you configure for each project that you work on. So you may have multiple projects, and they all feed through the dash. And then the shell script that it provides is really just a wrapper for the Docker Compose command. And you install that globally so that you have easy access to control both the central dash and your individual applications without jumping around directories all the time in the terminal. It's just a big time saver there. So as you're looking at that, you're probably like, Nginx proxy, DNS mask, what are these for? Why do I need these things? Oh my gosh. So as I've mentioned, or maybe failed to mention earlier, my first jump into Docker was a disaster. It really didn't work well. And this happened because I couldn't really get my head around how to run multiple projects in parallel. And as a web developer, we're constantly jumping between different sites for different clients or different sites that the organization we work for has. And so it's not very convenient if you can only run one of them at a time. So we have the problem because all of these containers and these applications run inside your Docker machine, and only that Docker machine has network access to your local computer. So unlike Vagrant, where you might spin up 4 different completely separate virtual machines, you really only have one here. And so the problem is you can only map one of these ports, port 80, port 443, port 336, those are the common ones we use for web serving and MySQL. You can only map those to one container at a time. So Dash solves this problem by adding the Nginx proxy into the mix. And so the proxy will actually look at the host name on the incoming request and send it to your appropriate container. It sounds super complicated. It actually is fairly complicated. But luckily, somebody else figured this out for me and for you and everybody else. And it works very reliably on its own with very little from us. And so to make things even easier, we've added DNS mask into the mix, which basically will automatically map all of the host names on a specific domain into this Docker machine so that you can basically spin up a new site in seconds. So how do we set up this wizardry? Are you excited yet? I'll warn you now, there's going to be a lot of steps here, but it's not hard because it's all put together. So I'm going to run through the details here very quickly, but the slides will be available and this repository will be available online. So I expect that you will download this later and follow through all the steps. Please do not try to do this as I talk through because it will be very fast. So let's get started. Obviously, you need Docker installed. You can download that from docker.com. And then you're going to clone the repository. The URL's there. I'll show it again at the end of the presentation. And then you're going to add the dash directory to your path, which just makes it accessible globally anywhere in your terminal. Instructions for this. You don't have to take these down. You can download these later. More steps for that. So after that, we're going to create a Docker network. This sounds complicated. It really isn't. You just type this command, and it's going to create a network called dash. And then we're going to put all of our containers and applications on that network so that they all talk to each other, because we want them to talk on this internal network so that the Nginx proxy can route to all of them. So next, we need to make our Mac or other computer resolve all .test domains with the DNS mask server. So this is pretty magical, and it works really well on a Mac. This is one of the things that I have not found a good solution for on other operating systems, but here are some instructions for doing that on the Mac. I would love to get some contribution from our Windows users about how to do this effectively. So the last thing is just setting up SSL. You don't have to do this, but it is super easy. There's a shell script in the repo. You just run it, and it'll generate some wildcard certificates. Just a little side note there. The certificate it generates actually secures anything dev.test, because you can only generate a wildcard certificate for a second-level domain, not a top-level domain. So your URLs look a little janky, but it's all in the name of saving you tens of seconds. So some instructions there. On the Mac, you can easily trust that certificate, and it will magically not yell at you in Chrome. And Safari, Firefox, unfortunately, doesn't follow the keychain and won't play nicely. So starting it up is very simple. You just type dev-up once you have this all set up, and you hit enter, and very untriumphantly, it will start up. I'm not doing a demo of this because there is literally nothing to see, but when you do this, everything will fire up, and you'll have some output like this. It'll start your Nginx proxy, your MySQL database, your DNS mask server. I have also added in Mailhog and phpMyAdmin in here, just kind of as examples. And they will all be running and waiting for you. So that's all fine and dandy, but what on earth did that actually do? That was kind of the default when you pull it down from the repo. But we're going to take a little walk through this dash.yaml file, which is really just a Docker Compose file. It's the one that Dash uses for its central dash. And so it's pretty simple to follow, but we'll take a little walk through. So you always start with this version up top. That just defines what version of the syntax to use for this. They changed kind of drastically between 1, 2, and 3, so it's important to declare that. And then you see we have our services, and we're going to start defining our services. So the very first one here is Nginx. And you can see that we are building it from a Docker file. That's what that build there is, and that points to a Docker file that's in the repo. And then we're going to expose port 80 to our local machine. When you have this ports keyword there, that is exposing the machine out to your virtual, to your main physical machine. We also have port 443 exposed. And then we are going to map the Docker socket in the volumes there. You do not need to understand what that means, but basically this Nginx proxy image, which is publicly available, looks at that, and that's how it automatically starts routing traffic to the right containers. Similarly, the certificates directory gets mapped in, and it automatically sucks all those in and just makes it work. So next up, we have the DNS mask server. And this is pretty simple, exposes port 53. And then you can see it's, I moved these around. But you can see the command there is where it defines what top-level domain that it's going to be providing DNS for. So in this case, we're doing .test. Next up, we have the MySQL container. We're just loading the publicly available MySQL image. And then we set a root password. And this is a very important feature of Dash here. So we're actually mapping a volume from the MySQL container to our hard drive. Otherwise, when you shut down your Dash, you will lose all of your databases. That is not fun and may remind you of some of the inferior methods of local development. So I would definitely recommend leaving that in there. And then you can see we're mapping out port 3306 so that we have direct access to the database from SQL Pro, etc. Next up, we have a utility called Mailhog, which is basically a fake SMTP server. It's a great little tool for testing when your application needs to send out emails. We actually map out port 1025 there, which is the port that you send mail through, and then we expose port 8025. When you see expose like this, it's slightly different than the ports because it only gets exposed inside the virtual machine, and so that will not be accessible from the main from your main machine. So you can see here, we have some environment variables, and these are the ones that the Nginx proxy actually looks for, the virtual host. And so we define what the URL that we want this to be accessible on, and virtual port, since the Mailhog container outputs on port 8025, we just tell the Nginx proxy to also look at port 8025, and then that'll get magically mapped to port 453 or 80 through the proxy. The last service that we have in here is phpMyAdmin. Just put this in kind of as another example of something you could add in here. Don't necessarily need it. We expose port 80, again exposed internally so that the proxy can pick it up. Same sort of configuration variables there, plus putting in your login so that it automatically logs you in. And last, and very important, is the networks. Basically, we're just telling it to use the Dash network that we defined earlier. And that's pretty much it. This is just a standard Docker Compose file, so you could easily extend this with anything that you need. You do want to keep in mind, however, that anything in the Dash is shared. So it works well for something like a database server. It may not work so well for something like Redis or Memcache, where it could be very site-specific and you don't want your data colliding between projects. So you have to think that through. But obviously, anything you can share across projects is wise to do so, just because it keeps you from running too many containers and bogging down your machine. So now we can look at setting up an individual project. With basically, you're just going to create a directory, and or use an existing project directory, and you're going to copy this example Docker Compose file that I've provided in the repo. Just copy it in there, and then you're going to configure it, and it's pretty simple. We're going to take a look through that file now. So again, we have the version 3 syntax, and then we jump into our services. So the first item here is a PHP and Apache combined image. I really like these Web DevOps images. They're publicly available. They have a few different ones. They have an Nginx one. etc. And you can use them. They're very, pre-configured and very easy to like customize without doing any kind of like work in your Docker file. So I really like these, especially for beginners. Moving down, we're going to see we set the document root here. The /app is actually just an arbitrary directory that it uses by default. And so since we generally keep our CMS code above the document root, I'm just mapping it one directory lower into the public directory here. You can obviously change that however you need for your specific project. Then we move to the virtual host. Again, you just define whatever you want the name of your domain to be, and that'll just magically pick it up when we start it up. And the last thing here is the HTTPS method. This is something that the Nginx proxy looks at if you have SSL certificates installed. In this case, it will redirect all insecure traffic to the secure URL. And the last thing is just our volumes. So we're mapping the directory of our project to /app on the container. And that just gives all of access to all of our files in the repo to the container so that it can run Expression Engine or whatever other application code you may have there. So that's pretty much it. Just adding the network at the end there, and it's ready to go. So we start it up. So similar to starting the dash, except you change into your project directory, and then you type dev up. Notice the lack of dash there. When you use dev up, with dash, it is controlling the local project, whereas when you type dev dash up, it's controlling the central dash. It's convenience there. And you can see it'll jump through. If you don't have your dash started, it'll start them for you first, and then it starts the container for your specific project last. Done. So we'll walk through a few other random little tidbits here, and we should be good to go. So obviously, as CMS developers, databases are important to us. So from your web server container, you actually have to use this MySQL hostname. Docker does kind of a lot of magic behind the scenes with host names and mapping them between different containers. And so you use this to reference the container name. So whatever container name you define in your dash, that is what you would use here. By default, I keep it as MySQL, and then obviously your username and password of root. From the local computer, if you're using SQL Pro, something like that, we have the port mapped through to our local machine, and so we use 127.0.0.1. With Mailhog, again, from the application, we point the SMTP server to Mailhog, which is the service name that's in the dash file. And then you can access the control panel for Mailhog from that URL. Pretty simple. And phpMyAdmin is pretty much the same thing. So that's kind of the basics. Walked you through it all here. It will be a lot clearer when you pull down this repo and look it through. Obviously, there's a lot more to be learned about Docker. But this is a really helpful start. We've found at Vector for our new developers and for friends that I've showed this to. But once you start up your project, you should be able to access it from the browser, and it should be good to go. So there's a few gotchas. Obviously, you need to make sure you're not using the ports that you map through to your main machine for something else. So if you're using MAMP, you have to either turn it off or change the ports there so they don't collide. If you have other server software running, you'll have to turn that off. Make sure you use dev down to shut down projects that you're not running. You can run as many as you want, but obviously your computer will get slower and slower the more you run. It is tempting to run a lot of them, but you will notice the effects pretty quickly. Few other useful tips: dev down to shut down, dev dash down shuts down the whole dash, which includes the database, and that is really helpful if you need to have a video call or something like that that needs some resources from your machine. The database tends to bog it down quite a bit. I also highly recommend downloading Kitematic, which is kind of a GUI for viewing your running Docker containers. You can view the output from each of those containers, which is very helpful for debugging. You can check that out. It's actually available from the Docker drop-down menu when you install Docker for the Mac, so you can just grab that. Also important is that you can run commands inside the Docker container. Unlike Vagrant, you're never going to SSH into your container. You can, don't do it. There really should not be a reason to do that. But you can run a command inside it right from your host machine. You do dev exec, and then you use the service name, which comes from your Docker compose file, and then whatever command you need. You do have to keep in mind that these containers tend to run fairly stripped down OS versions, so you can't just run any command that you might expect to find on like a standard Ubuntu server. They tend to be, have a little less on them, so you might have to explicitly install something. So that's the basic setup. There are a lot of images out there that you kind of poke through. There's a lot you can pull in, but you'll find that as you get going with this, it's very easy to just look for someone else's Dockerized version of whatever application you could possibly need. And there are generally some out there. Many of them are like supported by the main developers of whatever tool it is. But there's also a lot of kind of proprietary third-party ones out there as well. Couple other little ideas here to just toss in there. What about running your node dependencies in a Docker container so that you don't have to worry about what version of node you have, so you don't have to worry about installing node locally? You can do that. It's very simple. Similarly, what about if you want to share your work? ngrok is a great tool out there. There's an image out there for it. It kind of automates the process and lets you easily fire it up, and then suddenly you can access your site either from your mobile device if you want to check it there, or share it with another coworker, whoever. Works pretty well. So that's about it. Here are the links from the slides earlier, but I'm happy to take some questions at this point. Julian?
How many containers is too many?
In a specific application, or like running at one time? At one time? I don't know. Probably more than like 10, 15 at a time. But it really depends what you're running, how much data is involved there. If you're running like 14 MySQL servers, you probably have a problem. But that's kind of what we try to solve with Dash by having a central MySQL server. Because if you try to run an individual one for each project, it's going to get a little scary. Very easy. There's publicly available image for that. I actually do that for some of my side work that I do. So you would just go into that Dash YAML file, and you can just swap it to the Maria. It's super simple. Yeah, anyone else? TJ?
Does using Dash interact with or cause any problem with deploying your project as Docker containers to production? Or maybe
so I haven't done much with doing Docker in production, but presumably you could use the same, you might have a specific Docker file for your production usage, and you could definitely use that within your local Dash project as well. Generally, you keep a separate Docker compose file for different environments, but you can easily share. At Vector, we often share the same Docker file between our staging and our local at least. Anyone?
somebody else asked, what are the specific issues you mentioned? And we talked a little bit about topics in Slack. Those also left the beautiful garden of Apple behind underneath Windows. What are the specific gotchas that Dash has with Windows?
So there's basically two things. One is the automatic mapping. So the Mac allows you to map the entirety of .test to a specific DNS server. And that doesn't seem to have a parallel in Windows.
There are sort of.
I've seen like proxies, but they've heard their jank. The other side is just the actual dash script, the dev script that we're using is a Ruby script, and so that may or may not work elsewhere. Yeah, but that is saving you just a few seconds here and there, changing directories. Is that it? Stunned silence. I like it. All right, thank you.